are many ugly fonts in the world, there are many bad fonts, but there are only a handful of truly hated fonts. Two names tower over all others in the field of cringe-inducing typefaces: Comic Sans and Papyrus. Yet only one of them infamously became the subject of a short on Saturday Night Live. Starring Ryan Gosling as a man driven to obsession with the font's use as the avatar logo, the video has over 18 million YouTube views. Breaking with SNL tradition, Gosling is genuinely funny. When his therapist reveals they're working on Avatar sequels, he's relieved. So they fixed it? They changed the logo? Things in the sketch don't go well from there, but in real life there is some good news on that front. I spoke with John Rochelle, a prolific designer who co-founded Comicraft and now has his own company, Swelltype. John was commissioned to create a new custom font for Avatar sequels and spin-offs.
The only conversation we had about Papyrus was when I first talked to them. They said, so, like the day that skit came out, that was it for the day. Everybody was just sitting there responding to all their friends who were sending it to them. And it definitely had an impact on them. And I think what they wanted the branding to be for the reboot, it was at least partially driven by the fact that they were made fun of for it. You could tell that with the logo that they sort of kept that feel, that rustic feel where it's got the little divots taken out of it. When they sent me the logo, as an Illustrator file, one of the first things I did was just to kind of clean it up and simplify. They just said, we want to extrapolate out a whole alphabet out of this. Can you do that? So it was kind of a matter of just taking those 4 or 5 letters and then kind of building the rest of it out of that. The uppercase went pretty fast. The lowercase was a little more challenging. We tried 3 or 4 different kind of approaches on that till we settled on one.
When John posted about this project on LinkedIn, Chris Costello, the designer of Papyrus, replied with a tongue-in-cheek comment. Costello still works as a graphic designer today and seems quite well respected for his work in coin and medal design, including work for the United States Mint and the Royal Mint in the UK. Having read many interviews with the man during my research, it seems he's slowly come to accept his destiny as having designed one of the most reviled fonts in pop culture, and with age it seems he's been able to find the humor in it. It's not only SNL who has poked fun. Papyrus has been the subject of memes and jokes for years.
Papyrus? Are you kidding me? There's no place for that in a professional office setting.
Yes!
But why does it have such a notorious reputation? Well, to answer that question, we're going to have to go back to the beginning. In the early 1980s, certain things seemed immutable. The popularity of big hair, the unstoppable rise of the Rubik's Cube, and the dominance of paste-up in graphic design. But as we know, home computing would soon turn the design industry upside down with the advent of desktop publishing. The technical details of paste-up and photo typesetting are fascinating, but we'll have to wait for another video. Suffice it to say, it was an arduous process of physically cutting and pasting page elements, type, photos, and illustrations onto a board and aligning everything to grid by hand, before it was then photographed and converted to printing plates. But this gave designers greater creative freedom than they'd had with metal type. In graphic design, fonts used for large blocks of text are called body typefaces. These are usually quite conservative, but easy to read, and they try not to draw too much attention to themselves. On the other hand, display typefaces are fonts used at large size for short text like headlines and for advertising. These fonts can be much more expressive and eccentric. They're supposed to grab your attention, and the 1970s and 80s was a time of rapid growth and development in display typefaces. This was in large part thanks to a company called Letraset, which pioneered a new technology known as dry transfer lettering. These were sheets of alphabets, numbers, and other characters printed on a translucent film with pressure-activated adhesive. To transfer them directly to a layout, you would just burnish the top side with a pen or stylus. For customers, dry transfer lettering was inexpensive, easier to use, and allowed more flexible layout techniques compared with other available methods. But it was this combined with a much lower cost to produce and distribute compared with metal type that helped to propel Letraset to huge success. Fast forward to 1982, and a 23-year-old Chris Costello is working as a junior illustrator at a Florida ad agency. It's his first job out of art school, and they hit a 3-month lull in business. Being a devout Christian and the son of a signwriter, he begins playing around with lettering and starts imagining what the Latin alphabet might have looked like in biblical times. Based on these sketches, he creates an all-uppercase alphabet and pitches it to nearly a dozen different type houses. Only Letraset writes back. Now, Letraset was the clear market leader within their niche, with a huge catalogue of well-known fonts, including Helvetica, Futura, and other famous typefaces they licensed from other foundries. But they were also an incubator of new talent, especially when it came to display fonts. They offered a subscription to agencies, bureaus, and design studios called Letragraphica, which shipped new display typefaces in the post every month. Any unused sheets were simply mailed back to Letraset. This was a brilliant business model because it allowed them to take a gamble on new fonts from unproven talent without making a commitment to mass production or putting them directly into their main catalog. And so Letraset purchased Papyrus for the Letragraphica program for only £750, debuting in 1983. Of course, a sketch is not the same thing as production artwork for a typeface. The transfer sheets were all created using photographic production techniques. The British type designer Frida Sack began her career at the Letraset Type Studio, and she described the process in an interview.
The work was meticulous, and accuracy was essential. Having measured and analysed all the different aspects and features of a particular typeface, we could make a jig as a template, draw the outlines, and then cut the rubylith at between 4 and 6 inches cap height. Although termed instant lettering, the creation of it was far from an instant process. It used to take one person around 4 to 6 weeks to draw, cut and space one typeface. If we weren't working on the classic range, it would be on ideas for typefaces sent in by type enthusiasts. Most of these submitted typefaces were supplied to Letraset as quite rough, smaller scale drawings, sometimes just as marker sketches, and all had to be drawn up, and in most cases a fuller range of letters design. During most of the time that Letraset was producing typefaces, it was an accessible alternative to traditional hot metal typesetting. I suppose you could say it helped in the democratization of type.
The following year, Papyrus made it into Letraset's front catalogue, but it wasn't particularly noteworthy. It was just one of many novelty display fonts they published. Some have withstood the test of time, and others not so much. Papyrus could have easily joined the latter group and been forgotten by pop culture if it wasn't for a twist of fate over a decade later. When Microsoft released Publisher in 1991, it signaled that desktop publishing was going mainstream. Publisher wasn't intended to compete with software for design professionals like PageMaker or Quark Express. It was marketed to a different crowd, advertised as making it easy to create professional quality newsletters, business cards, brochures, and more. In late '97, they released an update to the small business edition of Microsoft Office with the newly released Publisher 98. This version included the headline feature ClipArt Live, which put Microsoft ClipArt on the internet for the first time. But that wasn't all. It also included a new suite of display fonts, including Papyrus. Fast forward a few years and Papyrus came installed by default with any version of Microsoft Office. Before broadband internet was widely available, having your font bundled by Microsoft was a huge deal. It was kind of like being picked out of obscurity to be signed by a major record label in the time before streaming music. It meant millions of users without any knowledge of typography had access to your font. In 2003, Apple included Papyrus as a system font with their operating system as well, reaching an even bigger install base. But the versions from Microsoft and Apple were not exactly the same. So let's pause to take a closer look at the design of the font itself. The ragged edges of Papyrus don't come from real ink over paper. This was made in the time before high-resolution digital scanning, so even if the original sketches had been made on highly textured paper stock, that just was not a possibility. The original masters are still in the collection of St. Bride Library, and we can see the original design was meant to be even more weathered, with patches of white space within the strokes, but these were retouched out at the last minute, likely because when reduced down to size, the detail was either lost or created other issues. Papyrus has a handwritten style, but it's not calligraphy or cursive. It's made up of mostly block letters with some unusual traits. In his original doodles, Costello was clearly experimenting with different styles of calligraphy, including uncial, black letter, and italic, but the final result shows very little of that, except for the distended bowl of the uppercase U, which has an uncial flavor. There are other quirks in the uppercase, like the high crossbar on the E, F, and H, for example. Originally, Costello's design didn't include a lowercase, but it was added on request from Letraset. As a result, the two cases feel a bit detached. For example, the capital and lowercase u don't match, but that distinctive bowl is found on the lowercase y. The X height is also quite short for a handwritten style, giving us unusually tall ascenders, and instead of the single story A and G found in handwriting, it uses double story versions more commonly found in type. Here we have the original master sketch, and we can see two sets of capital letters, a larger set with swash variants and a smaller set. Now, small caps are not unusual and are usually found in body text serif faces like Garamond or Palatino, but Papyrus doesn't have regular caps and small caps. No, these are regular capitals, and these are oversized titling capitals. Because dry transfer lettering came in sheets of only 1 point size, it meant that small caps weren't very useful for display text. But when the font was translated to digital form, Apple's version used the regular capital letters by default, while Microsoft went with the oversized set, which was never intended to be mixed with the lowercase. Compare the same text in these two different versions. This is part of why so much Papyrus looks terrible. The proportions are just plain wrong. The titling caps aren't even aligned to the same baseline. Personally, I think it does look better in all caps with titling initials, as originally intended. Letraset's own catalog from 1985 also seems to favor this configuration in their examples. So we just talked about the major problems with Papyrus and why it's kind of an odd font. I'm personally not a huge fan, and I don't think many other graphic designers are either. But the core audience for Papyrus had moved on from the domain of design professionals. Microsoft and then Apple made this font available to the general public, and there's something about it that a lot of people like. So let's talk about what it did right. There's a certain quirky charm to Papyrus. Its handwritten effect has a casual appeal that sets it apart from other default Microsoft Office fonts. It's not too stuffy or formal, but it's still highly legible, more so than many true handwriting fonts. So say it's 1998 and you want a font that's easy to read, but still has a bit of personality. Papyrus might be the way to go. Of course, in 2022, we have a lot more options than the system fonts that come with Office. But where do you go to find new and interesting fonts? Well, a great option would be this video's sponsor. Envato Elements is a subscription service that gives you access to over 11 million creative assets, including fonts, graphics, templates, brushes, and more. With Envato Elements, you can easily find the perfect font for any project, whether it's something casual and handwritten with the friendliness of Papyrus, or a clean, elegant sans serif. And if you want that worn, grungy texture, they've got you covered with a wide range of texture effects and add-ons for Adobe and other software. Plus, their library is constantly growing, so you'll never run out of creative options. I use Elements myself, both for my videos and as a graphic designer. I love their diverse and easy to use library, and the fact that they're B Corp certified is just the cherry on top. Their prices are also very reasonable, and the unlimited downloads mean I never have to worry about going over budget on creative assets. So if you want to up your design game or are looking for high quality assets for your next creative project, definitely check out Envato Elements. Using my link below will get you a 7-day free trial, and you can keep any assets you download even if you decide to cancel, so there's nothing to lose. Big thanks to Envato. By the late 2000s, Papyrus was reaching saturation point. Nobody can begrudge a grandma using Papyrus for her stand at the church bake sale, but things were getting out of hand. By 2008, there were 2 separate blogs solely devoted to showcasing tacky and inappropriate use of the font. This coincided with the peak of hate for Comic Sans, which points to just how massive Microsoft's influence was on popular typography at this time. As the smartphone era began with the launch of the iPhone in 2007, things would slowly begin to change, but even into the 2010s, Windows and Office had a major presence in people's lives. Most folks only ever used fonts that came pre-installed on their computer. This meant that small signwriters and print shops often used fonts that were familiar to their clients, even if they weren't the best choice from a design perspective. Papyrus, for as much as design snobs hated it, was extremely appealing to many people. As a result, a lot of small businesses used the font for signage and promotional material. In the 2000s, the concept of wellness also became increasingly mainstream, from yoga to organic food. And before it became big business, a lot of this stuff was grassroots or homemade, creating flyers for their workshops or labels for their organic granola at home, often using their own printer and papyrus to express a rejection of the industrial modern consumer lifestyle and an alternative that was quote-unquote natural. In 2009, the release of James Cameron's blockbuster Avatar pushed the font even further into the spotlight. The film featured a humanoid alien race called the Na'vi. Not only was the logo for the film based on papyrus, but it was also used for the captions whenever the Na'vi spoke in their alien tongue. This decision received a lot of criticism for many reasons, which I think are well captured in the viral SNL sketch. At the time, Avatar was a huge deal. The budget for the film was $237 million, and the budget for promotion was a further $150 million. So using a free system font that you might find on the sign for a strip mall nail salon felt glaringly out of place. It's the typographic equivalent to the latest Marvel blockbuster getting a cameo appearance from Spider-Man, but it's actually just some dude in a cheap Halloween costume. Especially amongst graphic designers, it was seen as a ridiculous choice. In the skit, Gosling is obsessed in part because he thinks papyrus seems like such an indifferent choice. But here, I'm going to disagree. When a typeface becomes well known, it's usually because it finds a niche. It comes to mean something beyond what the text itself might say. For example, Trajan becoming the movie poster font, which according to Eve Peters, happened in large part thanks to it becoming part of Adobe's default type library. Or the use of Gotham as a font for politicians and governments in general since its use for the successful Obama campaign in 2008. Papyrus has certainly not escaped this. To promote the Avatar sequel, The Way of Water, Empire magazine crowdsourced an interview with James Cameron, with questions submitted from actors, showbiz types, and surprisingly, one Chris Costello.
For better or for worse, papyrus is widely used to represent indigenous themes, as well as all things organic, natural, and new agey. Was the decision to use this font in Avatar at all inspired by its association today with Native American culture?
Cameron's answer is rather glib, claiming it was a decision by the art department he didn't really look that hard at. Clearly, Cameron is no Wes Anderson. He makes a passing reference to the SNL skit while laughing off the larger question that this raises, which is pretty ironic in a magazine literally called Empire. I've discussed how typographic stereotypes work in my previous video on Chop Suey fonts, so I'm not going to rehash it here. But you don't have to scratch too deep to see the exoticism implied by the use of papyrus in Avatar. Cherokee writer and artist Roy Boney Jr. wrote about his experience in 2015.
Papyrus has become an oft-used font for anything indigenous. But harm comes from the symbolism of papyrus being tied to ideas such as nature and ancientness. It paints us as noble, mystic savages while forcing us to continually live as relics of the past. These are the same ideas used throughout history to subvert us as people and attempts to destroy our cultures, languages, and land bases. It belittles our standing as vibrant 21st century people with strong cultures.
Far from being a careless choice, papyrus is the perfect embodiment of Avatar. The film's plot is famously generic. This led to multiple lawsuits alleging plagiarism on the part of James Cameron, all of which failed. But in the course of one 2012 suit brought by Gerald Murawski, Cameron submitted a 45-page sworn declaration detailing how he developed the concept and script for Avatar, concluding with a summary of his influences.
My reference points were diverse, from serious films about Europeans or Americans immersing in indigenous cultures, such as Lawrence of Arabia, The Man Who Would Be King, The Emerald Forest, Medicine Man, and The Mission, to animated films, such as The Jungle Book and Fern Gully. They included the Tarzan jungle stories and science fiction novels of Edgar Rice Burroughs, and the adventure stories of Rudyard Kipling and H. Rider Haggard.
Avatar has been criticized for its primitivism, exoticism, and perpetuating the cliché of the white savior. And while this isn't the main topic of this video, it's worth mentioning that if you needed a greatest hits of these harmful tropes, James Cameron's Netflix queue isn't a bad place to start. While its indigenous connotations are some of its most corrosive, I think it's worth acknowledging how broad a set of ideas papyrus has become associated with. In the visual language of food, for example, papyrus has been used to signal any foreign cuisine, regardless of its origin. It could be anything from sushi to feta cheese to jerk chicken. There's also the association with the organic and natural, and with New Age and alternative spirituality. But why is that? If you look at the design of papyrus, there's nothing particularly exotic about its letterforms. Going back to the original development sketches, we see mostly European calligraphy styles as inspiration. So what is it about the design that has led to such a strong association with these concepts? In 2019, author and blogger David Cavadi wrote an article called In Defense of Papyrus, which is over 6,000 words long. While it contains some technical errors and repeats some common myths about papyrus's origin, I think Cavadi's central argument is spot on. Papyrus breaks the rule of material honesty, which in design and architecture is the practice of using materials in a way that is true to their natural properties without attempting to hide or disguise them. The artificial rough texture of papyrus is a bit like how a child might age a treasure map by staining it with tea or coffee and burning the edges. It's trying to come off as something that it's not. This is a big reason for both papyrus's viral appeal and conversely the reason so many find it garish. This material dishonesty specifically falls into a subcategory I like to call exaggerated patina. You can see examples of this kind of thing all over film and television. Whenever a medieval village is depicted, it's usually dirty, brown, and dingy.
King, he hasn't got shit all over him.
Or whenever a scene takes place in Mexico or the Middle East, there's a sudden aggressive yellow or orange color grade. These visual cues are meant to quickly communicate that a place or time is different from our own, but they're not value neutral. They're a visual shorthand for showing that a place is other, maybe even primitive or dangerous. This is in contrast to the reverse trope of sci-fi color grading, where scenes set in the future or featuring advanced technology are often depicted with a distinctly cold color grade. Avatar is a rare exception where both tropes are combined, the sci-fi color palette together with the primitive patina of papyrus. Today, while it's hardly become an obscure font, you're less likely to find papyrus out in the wild than just a decade ago. This isn't because the font has become shunned per se, but more a reflection of technology moving forward. In the age of smartphones and social media, Microsoft have been declining in relevance. People today are just as likely to use Google Docs or Canva as they are to use Microsoft Office. And most of what we read is online on our phones, not in hard copy documents. The center of gravity has shifted, and Google fonts now have much more influence on popular typography than ones from Microsoft. So, does papyrus deserve its bad reputation? Some people say that the opposite of love is not hatred, but indifference. And whatever else may be said, papyrus does not evoke indifference in people. Whether a font is good or bad is highly context specific. Like its notorious classmate Comic Sans, its major sins were being too eccentric and too accessible at the same time. Ultimately, papyrus was not just a product of the time that created it, but of the last 40 years in type technology. Desktop publishing and home computers killed Letraset, but Microsoft gave papyrus a second career, making it one of the most used and abused typefaces of the 20th century. It was a friendly face in a gallery of otherwise serious type options. It became a shorthand for yoga classes, herbal tea, and a catch-all signifier of otherness. It might be one of the most obnoxious and genuinely hated fonts of all time, but Papyrus might also be one of the last fonts that was ever truly a household name. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive on the world's second most hated font. Special thanks as always to my patrons over on Patreon. As this video goes live, I'm just going to be shy of 100,000 subscribers, which is a crazy milestone. Thank you to everyone who has watched, and if you also would like to support the channel, there's a new $1 a month level on Patreon if you want to see some longer versions of interviews with my guests like John Rochelle and other behind the scenes shenanigans. If you enjoyed watching this and want to keep watching, I highly recommend you watch either my breakdown on the top 10 most influential Microsoft fonts over here, or my deep dive on the origins of Chop Suey lettering over here. My name is Linus, thank you for watching, and I hope I'll see you in a future video.